Dear friends, the EU is abolishing the de minimis rule, which essentially used to allow packages in the value below €150 to be imported into the EU duty-free, with import VAT still applicable, however. This measure will enter into force as of July 1st, 2026. The duty will apply to each commodity line, meaning that if you are importing jeans under the value of €150 and all of those jeans fall under the same commodity code, €3 duty rate will be applied. If, however, you are importing a pair of jeans, a shirt, a pair of glasses, and a toy, each of those goods will have a separate €3 duty rate applied to them because they all classified under different commodity codes. Is this the death of Shein and Temu and Alibaba? Who hasn't bought those cool, cheap, very interesting goods from China? But currently the expectation is that no more cheap goods from China. And today this is the topic that I will be exploring. So let's dive in. So let's start with a bit of history. Up until 2010, the de minimis threshold was set at €45. But due to the administrative burden, the EU decided to increase that amount to €150. At the time, e-commerce wasn't as prominent, and so smaller parcels was something that your grandma would send you from a foreign land. And it was considered that did not merit as much attention and would require unnecessary administrative burden placed onto the customs authorities. But fortunately or unfortunately, this rule was turned into a massive tax-free highway, which e-commerce businesses have enjoyed, same as their consumers. Platforms like Shein and Temu that made huge investments into marketing have gained extreme prominence on EU markets, allowing EU consumers to order very cheap goods that were transported by plane and within 10 to 15 days would be with the consumer. No duties paid, with exception of import VAT, of course. At the moment, this new rule of €3 applied per commodity line is expected to bring to the EU hundreds of millions in revenue annually. And mind you that the duties accrued by the EU go to the EU Commission that then allocates those as an overall EU budget that is distributed amongst different policies, needs, etc., like the Common Agricultural Policy, for example, or other cohesion programs or research, etc. Individual countries are allowed to retain about 25% of the accrued duties. The final EU budget is not exclusively allocated by the EU Commission, but by other actors within the European Union, like the European Parliament or the Council of the EU, to ensure that the funds are democratically and fairly distributed. But going back to our Shein and Temu story, let's look at data. Data states that about 91% of the shipments related to the small parcels originate in China, heavily driven by direct-to-consumer marketplaces like Shein and Temu. Additionally, it has also been found that 65% of all small shipments entering the EU are misdeclared or undervalued, which means that every time that someone sends a shipment of €150, there's no guarantee that the goods inside that parcel, that package, are actually worth €150. In fact, they're usually worth much more. And of course, it's easier to misdeclare the value of the product if it allows you to avoid the customs duties on import. High value goods like electronics or designer goods are routinely labeled at a lower price so they can slip in duty free. Additionally, the main issue ends up being with the sheer amount of import declarations related to the small parcels. Just in 2024, EU consumers imported approximately 4.6 billion low-value e-commerce shipments. In 2025, that value rose to 5.6 billion e-commerce shipments. And so the customs authorities, as you can imagine, are having difficulties reviewing all of those parcels, and they end up being declared in bulk instead, which causes serious concern related to security, because a lot of different goods declared and obviously not checked are transporting things that are not necessarily what the label states. In this regard, there's quite a lot of drug trafficking happening, for example. In comparison, obviously the majority of imports are still expected to be in bulk. And if you look at the total weight, massive bulk container shipments still dominate trade. But if you look at the number of customs declarations, individual small parcels have completely taken over. Generally speaking, your traditional retailer tends to import in bulk and pay customs duties on the bulk. Of course, the value declared is the one marked by the supplier from somewhere in Asia, and it is considerably lower than the value that the consumer ends up paying, and so that margin still ends up working for the buyers in the EU. The bulk imports, even if they have different commodity code lines, they tend to submit one import declaration, whereas imports for low-value consignments require separate import declarations every time. Generally, they would place the customer as the importer, placing them as a delivery address. And of course, then the shipping companies can act as representatives or as importers themselves, removing all liability from the correctness of the data, considering the fact that these are items imported for personal use. So if we were to explore the business models of Temu and Shein, we would see that what they do is they almost entirely rely on flying small parcels into the EU directly to consumers. Shein uses a small batch agile framework where they produce about 100 or 200 pieces of the same product, and then they observe whether the consumer picks on it, and if the item becomes particularly popular, they end up remanufacturing and making it more available. Temu takes it a step further, where different factories in China are allowed to list their unbranded items on the app, bypassing all middlemen. So it essentially works a little bit like Amazon. This model seems to be only working if the orders are actually valued at 150 euro. But I do believe that Shein and Temu have found solutions to that, where they would declare specific items separately in one import declaration, but then when the goods would arrive at their 3PL, their storage hub, for example, they would then repackage those goods into one unique package. And so even if your order were to be higher than 150 euro, it does not necessarily mean that all of the items in your order were included in the same import declaration. The understanding, however, is that these platforms rely on and thrive on microtransactions where their margins are related to the sheer bulk of items that they sell. So despite the fact that the items are being imported on a one-by-one basis direct to consumer, the sheer volume of items sold then ends up bringing the actual margins to the sellers. If, however, we start applying a 3 euro duty rate onto individual items, this will be quite a hit to their business model, because all items will have to become more expensive. And so platforms like Shein and Temu will absolutely have to think about a different strategy. But of course, I believe that they have been thinking of different strategies. They have been opening storage hubs for quite some time. These logistics hubs and storage hubs did not necessarily require those companies to avoid the 150 de minimis rule, because the EU legislation allows for the different warehouses to be authorized to act as customs warehouses. This means that imports in bulk can be imported under duty suspension, which means that even though the goods are being placed in those warehouses, the duties aren't paid, and then with which subsequent customer order, a separate import declaration is filed. And the same logic where the de minimis rule is enjoyed remains. Now, does that mean that Shein and Temu and Alibaba are safe? No. It means that they will fundamentally have to restructure their business models and eventually adapt. I'm sure they will be drawing lessons from the EU established businesses. The big conglomerate Inditex is a big example to look at. Inditex owns all of the different shops present on the market at the moment that are relatively low value and are slightly more expensive than the prices imposed by Shein and Temu when it comes to clothing. Inditex is a great example of how local EU businesses handle retail, because what they generally do is they promote manufacturing in countries like Spain and Portugal, which doesn't, however, mean that they do not import goods from China and India, for instance, because they do import quite a lot of textiles from those regions to essentially process them in the EU after they've brought in cheap commodities for transformation, or they send those to countries like Morocco and Egypt, with which the EU has a free trade agreement, to then import those into the EU duty-free. But of course, let's not forget about smaller EU-based e-commerce businesses that heavily rely on imports from China and India, for example. And so when the European e-commerce brands import low-value consignments, they will be facing exactly the same kinds of import duties. Although I do believe that European-based companies are primarily focused on importing in bulk rather than import by low-value parcel. Although, of course, there are different contracts offered by the Chinese or Indian or Bangladeshi or different other suppliers. And so surely this won't affect exclusively Chinese brands operating in the EU, but may also affect a variety of businesses that are EU-based. While this may be a defense mechanism towards the European-based retailers or European-based e-commerce platforms, the Chinese e-commerce platforms will certainly adapt and find their way. No matter what, price increases are to be expected. But of course, that's not the only expectation that we should have, because adopting such a drastic measure, considering the sheer amount and the sheer volume of import declarations previously processed by the customs authorities, it is expected that the digital platforms for import declaration and the variety of softwares will likely suffer with this measure, and I do not believe that it will be implemented seamlessly and without any problems. So because this is a regulation on the EU level, it becomes legally binding for every single EU country. And because it is the individual countries that process the imports, they will have to adapt their own softwares and their staff to this new measure. To execute this measure, the EU will be using its import one-stop shop system. That's a centralized digital portal for e-commerce that is already being used for the EU VAT payments. Starting in July, these online platforms are legally required to collect the additional duties on the low-value parcels up to €150. While the EU's final objective would be to fully centralize the import declaration system, calling it the EU Customs Data Hub, which will be run by a brand new EU Customs Authority, expected to be operational by mid-2028-2029. Until then, the EU is essentially forcing 27 different countries with legacy national customs databases to process billions of item-level lines. Logistics companies like FedEx and UPS have already openly warned businesses to brace for impact. It is highly expected, basically guaranteed, the national customs authorities will not be able to manage this new measure and will most certainly make processing errors. And a lot of systems are also expected to go down due to the sheer volume, as well as the processing in terms of the financial systems involved, as well as the control of actual items entering the EU. So right now, with this measure, every single parcel that enters the EU will require better data declared regarding the parcel and the goods within it. There will be required more precision in classification of goods, as well as item quantities. Let's assume that a merchant makes a typo in a product description, or a national computer glitches when reading a Chinese manufacturer's ID. That package will be flagged automatically and may be trapped in the customs bottleneck, where they will need to reassess the import data entered and correct it in order to release those packages for free circulation in the EU. There's already been a certain preview of this measure going wrong. Earlier this year, France introduced its own local small parcel fee of €5, just as a test run. And in the very first week, the sudden paperwork caused a staggering 92% drop in small parcel customs declarations. And airlines immediately cancelled around 50 cargo flights because the system completely choked. France isn't alone in this. Romania has also introduced a €5 local logistics fee. Italy is rolling out a €2 fee. And of course, different member states will be stacking on their own administrative fees. And mind you, this will be on top of the already imposed €3 per commodity code. This measure, of course, will not last forever. Around November 2026, there was a proposition to introduce an additional €2 processing fee for the administrative burden that will follow. Again, this is on top of the €3 per item. And by 2028, there will be full integration of this system of the EU data hub, customs data hub, where the €3 transitional fee will expire and the regular ad valorem duties will be applicable. The good news is the United Kingdom will for now remain the same and will not eliminate the de minimis rule until 2029. So the UK still has a few good years of e-commerce. In the meantime, if you are an e-commerce business and you will likely require some support dealing with this, especially if the systems are flagging your packages, please do not hesitate in contacting me. I will be more than happy to help you out. Please also let me know what you think in the comments. Leave a like, subscribe. But in the meantime, thanks for watching and see you next time.